Thank you, Shamika, for joining us for this interview and the event.
Thank you for calling.
Yeah, we've read your paper on which is called the reality check on suicides in India, and it brings to the forefront a lot of important reasons why farmer suicides are so high in India. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your research findings?
Sure. So thanks once again for giving me this opportunity. We have been hearing about suicides in the media quite a bit across the country. This is not just national media. Suicide somehow, it has widespread interest, and yet the specific set of interventions that we have been talking about in terms of policy interventions to take care of them have been very limited. We only talk about debt waivers. We talk about expanding the moratorium for loans, extending more institutional credit. So they have been very simplistic from the point of view of almost entirely credit. And yet, the objective way to analyze this problem would be to look at national data on suicides. So we basically started this research by looking at what the Government of India's Home Ministry puts together is the National Crime Record Bureau, the NCRB data, which records every reported suicide in the country, and it tells you the basic demographics of male, female, age. It tells you where and what's the occupation. So it helps us map the extent of the problem. But the first thing that struck us was not farmer suicide as much as the fact that nearly 20% of all suicides in India over a very long period of time have been housewives. So really, if we wanted to study suicides as a public policy problems, then it's the housewives that we should really be focusing our energy on. And I think this is where the Ministry of Women and Child Development comes in a very big way. Of course, it's because it is their mandate, but also now we want to understand what makes housewives so vulnerable. The second demographic, which is consistently again remained around 10%, but has shown the maximum decline, so it is improving, are farmers. Now, farmer suicides is a very political and emotive issue in India. And yet, and though it's a very morbid subject that we are looking at, but the good thing is that farmer suicides are actually falling. And it's falling in almost all states. And that's a good news. And the maximum decline has happened over the last 10 years, which has also been the period when we have witnessed highest growth. So somehow, with respect to farmer suicide, we seem to be doing many things right. And yet the problem still remains significant in terms of the absolute numbers. The other categories are, of course, government employees, students, businessmen. So the data gives you breakup of every different demographics. So the first talk was housewives. It's not farmers that are the big, demographics affected. But the second thing that jumped out from the data was the fact that one usually thinks of debt as one of those driving factors. And yet the data consistently for the last 20 years is showing that it's illness. It's mental and physical illness that is leading people to commit suicide. Debt is really, it's less than 5%. And this is the case in almost, again, all demographics. So debt is a very small, it's less than 5%. And it's very similar to what the minister spoke about some months back, love affairs. But the big issue is health. It's mental and physical health.
So brings me to my second question is, why is farmer suicide such a big policy concern? Why aren't the housewives that you're talking about getting more attention, and it's all about farmer suicides?
Well, I think all suicides, and particularly if it happens as a contagion, which is what the farmer suicides have started to look like, because almost all farmer suicides in Maharashtra are concentrated in 6 districts. And they're not even the really poor farmers. These are better off farmers where almost 85% of them have land holding more than 2 acres and 60% have more than 4 acres. So those are well-off farmers with good access to capital. And so they are not the usual suspects and vulnerable crowd you think of when you think of suicide victims. I think farmer suicides is an emotional issue, is also a political issue in India, because India is an agrarian community, still very much an agrarian society because of the large amount, number of people who remain back and are dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. And also because, this entire Gandhian view of, India lives in the villages, we have to take care of the farmers, they feed us. It's all for the good. I think, the energy that is being put behind farmer suicides is needed. We just need to shift it a little, more towards the housewives as well, because housewives traditionally in almost all economies, they have not been recognized as being a productive member of an economy, because we don't really measure their outcomes. But more importantly, I think it also reflects India's gender inequality, and the way we tend to accept gender inequality as a fact of life, and it's one of those morbidities that you live with.
And in your paper, you looked at Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh a lot, and you compared it with UP and Bihar.
Right.
So when you saw Maharashtra, the data shows that Vidarbha and Marathwada have the highest rates.
That's correct.
Did you see any patterns when you looked at Maharashtra data?
We do see patterns, and in fact, the patterns are puzzling, because, again, if suicides are an outcome of distress, then there are no obvious reasons to believe that Andhra Pradesh and Maharashtra, the farmers would be any more distressed than UP and Bihar. And yet, if you look at the suicide mortality rate, which tells you the number of suicides per lakh farmer population, then while Maharashtra has steadily around 20 to 40, between 20 and 40%, in UP Bihar it is less than 5, and systematically so. So that makes you wonder that what aspect of these 6 districts of Maharashtra and some in Telangana is driving people towards this. That's when we started to pull apart and look at the distribution of the land holding, so it's the better off farmers. It seems to be concentrated on 6 districts, so it might have something to do with the crop pattern. And yet, if you look at causes of suicides, then overwhelmingly it is health, it's mental and physical health. So that takes us to some of the other reports that have come out, which talk about depression, which talk about substance abuse, alcoholism, and the recent Pew Research data that was distributed for global, all countries, they found that the major cause of disability in India happens to be major depression. It's not HIV, it's not iron deficiency, it's not war, it's not many other things that other countries suffer with. Lower back pain happens to be one of those. In India, it's depression. And if you look at some of the state reports from Telangana and Maharashtra, it seems to point exactly towards this direction, that it is mental health is not yet recognized as a major source of disability, which I think we should, absolutely.
Which the follow-up question to that would be then, what are the interventions or reforms that you suggest the government must make in order to control these high rates?
So, one reason why we sort of hang our hats on mental health is that it's not just the farmers. It's the housewives, it's the students, it's the business or the private sector employees, it's the public sector employees. Maharashtra reports significantly higher suicide mortality for all these demographics. And that tells you that there's something happening, there's something wrong in this neighborhood, which could be driving. So again, it's not limited to farmer suicides, which is why we say that the interventions have to be focused much more on healthcare. And within healthcare, I think it has to be primary health centers, where we have to start screening people. We have to start evaluating people and sort of picking up some of the early warning signals that are very necessary to sort of stop some of this contagion. Now, the reason I keep saying contagion is again because of the geographical, the concentration of these suicides. And yet, almost all the research on suicidology will tell you that one way to stop contagion is to have very sensitive reporting, to not sensationalize, not simplify, definitely try and make suicide seem like a bad option. It's a bad thing to do. And that's what sensitive reporting is about. It's about stemming or stopping future copycat suicides. And our media is anything but doing that. Our media sensationalizes it, it oversimplifies it. We only look at the final cause, it's the straw that broke the camel's back. And we're just stacking the straws and seem to be putting all our eggs in the debt basket and believing that if you just give more and more institutional debt, it'll take care of the problem, and it definitely hasn't. So no, screening. In the public health centers, we need to make mental health screening, particularly for vulnerable and people who are at risk and who can be picked up, by the way. There are community services which do pick out some kinds of pointers about who are the vulnerable crowds and to do an early warning towards them. And then possibly then think of rehabilitation, think about interventions in form of you know, medication or counseling. There are many other things that one can do, but screening is the first thing that we should do.
Okay. My last question was what you just mentioned about sensitive reporting and how it can actually impact the magnitude.
Right.
So you answered that question.
The one thing though, I think in India, which we have to look at very seriously around the, you know, farmer suicide problem in particular, you know, the way we dramatize it, it tells you that there are no guidelines that media houses are following. And yet if you look at major media houses like the BBC or the Guardian, there are very strict codes of conduct. There is a specific guideline for how you can report suicides. And the main reason is that you don't want to make it a copycat suicide. You don't want to incentivize people. Or, well, even if you don't incentivize, but you make it inappropriate. It doesn't rationalize people's responses when they commit suicides. And, you know, this kind of reporting should be part of journalism curriculum. It has to be done in a way that people are sensitive about, you know, they're held responsible for reporting of suicides if there are more suicides done because of that. And there is empirical evidence to support that based on the nature of reporting, you will see the probability of future suicides going up within the viewership or the readership area. So that has been established. Okay. And we need to be sensitive. And I think this is where, in terms of public policy, one way to handle this, other than the health interventions, is also to look at media and the way they report and sensationalize this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shamika, for this.
You're welcome.